A quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. I'll start by recognizing myself and Ranking Member to present our opening statements. And without objection, the members of the subcommittee will be recognized to present their opening remarks. I ask that they do so in a timely manner to allocate time for all present members. Now I yield myself time to present my opening statement. Earlier this summer, on July 16th, the Panamanian government discovered and detained the North Korean-flagged Changchungang cargo vessel traveling from Cuba. Found on board were 25 cargo containers of Cuban weapons and other UN-sanctioned items bound for the rogue regime in North Korea. In anticipation of the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee, their impending report on the incident, I've convened this subcommittee today to investigate further Cuba's recent history of military proliferation and noncompliance with UN sanctions, and to review the options available to the subcommittee to attempt to hold Cuba accountable for their violations. The facts in this case are not in dispute. At the time of their discovery, the Cuban Foreign Ministry said that the tanker was carrying 10,000 pounds of sugar, 10,000 tons of sugar, and 240 metric tons of obsolete defensive weapons, including disassembled missiles, 2 MiG-21 jet fighters, and 2 disassembled anti-aircraft missile complexes to be repaired and returned to Cuba. But here's what the Panamanian officials actually found hidden among the bags of Cuban sugar: night vision equipment, small arms and light weapons ammunition, rocket-propelled grenades, and artillery ammunition for anti-tank guns. This cargo is a clear violation of the UN sanctions imposed on North Korea after its series of nuclear bomb tests. This is a potentially groundbreaking case where a country in the Western Hemisphere is likely to be found in violation of the UN Security Council sanctions on weapons proliferation. Many experts believe, and the Castro regime itself has actually admitted to the violation of international sanctions in this case. I'm convinced that this case should and would be getting a lot more international attention if not for the daily and deadly news coming out of Syria, and now heinous al-Shabaab acts of terrorism at the mall in Nairobi, Kenya. The narrative that defenders of the Castro regime would like us to believe is that much of the weaponry was to be repaired and or modernized and returned to Cuba, and that it is no longer involved in such illicit activities. But at least in this instance, it is undeniable that they got caught red-handed in direct violation of the sanctions, and they must be held accountable. This subcommittee has been told that knowing it is in violation of international sanctions, the Castro regime has begun a full charm offensive at the UN to convince Sanctions Committee that it should, in fact, be applauded for its compliance and cooperation in this case, rather than punished and sanctioned for its international and an intentional breach of this sanctions regime. Failure to hold the Cuban government fully responsible will also be a slap in the face to our allies. If Cuba is allowed to get away with this time, it would send a terrible message to Panama, which put its resources and its reputation on the line to intercept this vessel. Even worse, other countries in the future might decide it simply isn't worth the cost and energy of pursuing similar violations, to the benefit of rogue regimes in North Korea and Iran. A further concern is that it appears that the Cuban military's rogue business activities are growing increasingly dangerous. Yet current U.S. travel policy continues to feed the Cuban military's business interests. For example, U.S. travelers to Cuba stay almost exclusively at the Cuban military's 5-star hotels. I believe that this policy should be halted, and that remittances from the U.S. should not be allowed to further fuel the moribund Castro regime. If Cuba is not properly reprimanded in the strongest terms available, it could very well embolden Venezuela and other ALBA states to find ways to help other rogue regimes. We know Venezuela has already been helping Iran skirt U.S. financial sanctions. Allowing Cuba to get away with violating international weapons sanctions would send a very dangerous message to the international community at large. I very much look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses today as we delve further into these questions and how the subcommittee can most effectively work to ensure international sanctions are upheld with meaningful consequences for any violations. And I yield time to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Sears.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The last time advanced weapons were shipped to and from Cuba, the world had come close to the brink of nuclear war than in any other time. It was October 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was installing ballistic and tactical nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles south of the United States coast. Today, we know that Cuba had the capability to launch without Russian codes or consent, and had even pleaded Moscow to launch weapons already on the island, even after the withdrawal was initiated. President Kennedy thwarted a dangerous game of nuclear chess played by the Soviet and Cuban regimes. Now, nearly 51 years later, we find Cuba has taken in a different partner in North Korea to partake in the illicit transfer of contraband, arms, and weaponry. Staunch anti-Americanism, anti-democratic values, and defiance of world order have isolated and strengthened a historically distant relationship between the two communist nations. On July 10th, earlier this year, Panamanian authorities seized a North Korean freighter declared to be carrying 10,000 tons of sugar from Cuba, only to discover a hidden cargo of Soviet-made anti-missile system components, fighter jet parts, and engines. In doing so, inspectors encountered a defiant 35-member North Korea crew and a captain who even attempted to take his own life to prevent inspection. Days later, Cuban government acknowledged the contents of the cargo as mere obsolete defensive weapons to be repaired and returned to Cuba, adding that the sugar was a humanitarian gift to North Korea. This was not the first transshipment of its kind, neither Cuba nor North Korea had any intent of disclosing their transgressions or contents of the illicit cargo. Further inspection has in fact revealed the cargo to include over 25 hidden containers, military vehicles, and like new ammunition and hardware in original casings. However, North Korea's involvement in the Cuban declaration has only raised more questions than it has answered. If only for repairs, then why did Cuba not ask other nations instead of breaking various UN Security Council's resolutions banning armed transfers, especially to North Korea? And with North Korea doing its best to refurbish its military hardware, it is more likely that fighter jets were intended to stay in North Korea. And at the same time, a barter arrangement may have been reached to transfer some equipment to North Korea for repairs, with sugar serving as payments. Without a doubt, the nature and contents of the seizure itself and the existence of a barter agreement reflect the dire economic conditions and level of desperation in both states. Nonetheless, irrespective of the purpose or intent, absolute weaponry or not, the transfer of these items is a clear violation of UN Council's resolutions, Security Council resolution. Meanwhile, Panamanian authorities have recently declared that the preliminary UN Security Council report has determined Cuba's North Korea-bound arms cargo to be in violation of UN sanctions. However, that Cuba has, by its own admission, acknowledged its concealment and is presumably cooperating with the UN inspectors should be seen with great doubt. Cuba and North Korea starve their people of common dignity, freedom of speech, and human rights. They have not abided by world norms and are unlikely to do so. The U.S., together with the UN Security Council, should enforce present sanctions against North Korea and be undeterred in punishing Cuba for violating them. Laws are not enforced and defended will lose value and respect. The U.S. and the UN should demonstrate that there are consequences to defying international laws. And I look forward to hearing the panelists' comments.
Thank you. The Chair yields to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This weapons proliferation violation in our own hemisphere poses a direct threat to our national security interests. Allowing the Castros to go unaccountable sends a terrible message to allies like Panama, who risk their time and resources to stop this vessel, and also to Venezuela and other rogue regimes who seek to cooperate further with North Korea or Iran. We must not allow U.S. people-to-people travelers to stay at Cuba luxury resorts, which are owned by the Cuban military, as you pointed out. Additionally, this administration must reinforce the already existing ban on visas for regime officials and their family members. Allowing Castro family members and regime officials to be issued travel visas to come here sends a message of impunity. It eliminates the dissuasive effect for repressors. This is a time for the administration to hold the Castro regime accountable for its actions, not a time to engage in normalization efforts with the regime. A U.S. citizen languishes in a Cuban jail. This international violation now comes to light, and yet the U.S. sits across the table from the Cuban regime on postal service issues. Incredible. Both North Korea and Cuba were in clear violation of UN sanctions, yet neither nation has suffered any consequences from this act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
Thank you. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Falemi Vega.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and our ranking member for calling this hearing. With Panama's recent interdiction of North Korea's ship, the Changkongang, many of the issues that have traditionally taken center stage in the Western Hemisphere suddenly become somewhat trivial. We are no longer just concerned with drug interdictions or trafficking, government corruption, or democracy. We have now added, out of nowhere, it seems, arms and proliferation in the ongoing agenda. But did this exchange between Cuba and the North Korea really come out of nowhere? Were there any warning signs? Was this an isolated incident? Now, what about the intelligence that Panama received? The Panamanian authorities seized the vessel under suspicion of drugs aboard the ship. While the intelligence was wrong, it nonetheless led to the discovery of a very alarming situation here in the Western Hemisphere. I am concerned that there is much speculation and supposition surrounding this event. The truth is we just do not have the information we need to take a next step or even appreciate the implications of this situation will have on the United States, on our neighboring countries, and on our government-to-government relationship within the region. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I want to personally offer my welcome to Ms. Nitkin and Ms. Werlau for their testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Does the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, choose to make an opening statement?
Just to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and on holding this hearing. I think it's vitally important that the United States, while confronting serious challenges throughout the world, not lose sight of the fact that we have one of the world's longest-lasting tin pot dictatorships right near our coastline. And this regime is a disgrace and has held the people of Cuba back for so long. We need to, again, reaffirm that we are on the side of the people of Cuba and against their dictatorship. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 7 days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Now I'd like to introduce the panel. First of all, we have on Skype Mr. Hugh Griffiths. He's a senior researcher and head of the Countering Illicit Trafficking Mechanism Assessment Projects at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. He's conducted a wide variety of investigation into arms trafficking via sea and air in Africa, the Middle East, and Korean Peninsula, working on behalf of a variety of United Nations, European Union, and North American organizations, agencies, and member states. He holds a Ph.D. research certificate and a Master of Philosophy in International Political Economy, as well as a postgraduate degree in the International Relations and Law from the University of Amsterdam. We also have Ms. Werlau. She is the Executive Director of Cuba Archive. This initiative seeks to advance human rights through research and scholarship. For years, she has tracked Cuba's relationship with North Korea and other rogue states. Ms. Werlau holds a bachelor's degree of science in foreign service from Georgetown University and a master's degree in international affairs from Universidad de Chile. Mrs. Nikitin, did I say that right? What is it, Nikitin? Nikitin is a specialist in nonproliferation in the Foreign Affairs, Defense, and Trade Division at the Congressional Research Service. Ms. Nikitin research covers nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons nonproliferation issues, including nuclear security, nonproliferation, threat reduction assistance, and nuclear energy cooperation. She earned a BA with majors in government and French at Dartmouth College and a master's in international policy studies and certificate in nonproliferation studies from Monterey Institute of International Studies. Let's begin. Mr. Griffiths, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, thanks for this invitation to testify today. I've been asked to present on CIPRI's investigation and analysis of the attempted illicit transfer associated with the North Korean vessel, the Chongchong-gang, that was interdicted by the Panamanian authorities transporting arms from Cuba in July of 2013. Given your geographic focus on the Western Hemisphere, I will today mainly address Cuba's role in this violation of United Nations sanctions, as well as Cuba's links with North Korea and in particular, earlier voyages by North Korean vessels to Cuba for the period 2006 to 2013 that I believe merit further investigation. The focus here will thus be on maritime trafficking. Before addressing these matters, I would like to say a few words regarding the work of U.S. government-related entities in the fields of counterproliferation, export control, as well as maritime and airborne-related trafficking. The CIPRI research publications for which I've been responsible acknowledge the cutting-edge science, unique expertise, and resources of a wide variety of U.S. government departments, agencies, and related entities charged with counterproliferation and export control, as well as maritime trafficking of military equipment, dual-use goods for weapons of mass destruction purposes, and narcotics. Over the years, during the course of field investigations and research around the world, I've had the privilege of interacting with dedicated officials and experts from the U.S. Departments of State, Defense, Justice, Treasury, as well as members of the U.S. intelligence community. The breadth and depth of their expertise and resources are unparalleled, as are their abilities to build capacity amongst U.S. allies and partner states in the fields of counterproliferation, export control, and counter-trafficking. As federal lawmakers and budget approvers, I'd like to say to you today that U.S. engagement at the international level on these issues is really critical in terms of mitigating the associated risks. Both the dedicated individuals and programs that I've had the opportunity to interact with over the past 10 years deserve your continuing support because they do a good job on these critical issues of national and international security concern. Put simply, no other country has the expertise and resources to undertake this work in the same way. I should make full disclosure and note that in 2013, the projects at CIPRI that I am responsible for received a grant from the Department of State's Export Control and Related Border Security Program, EXPIS, whose mandate covers some of the areas I've mentioned above. But to sum up and introduce the rest of this testimony, I believe the Chongchong-gang case serves as the most recent open source example to highlight the critical role played in counterproliferation and export control by U.S. government departments, agencies, and programs funded from the federal budget. As members of Congress may be aware, following the Chongchong-gang seizure in July of this year, open source media reports quoted unnamed U.S. officials as saying that the Panamanian authorities were tipped off by their U.S. counterparts as to the illicit nature of the vessel's cargo. In other words, it was a U.S. tip-off that prompted the interdiction by Panama. It should also be noted that Panama is a U.S. partner thanks to long-standing bilateral counter-trafficking activities, as well as through multilateral export control and customs initiatives such as the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC, Container Control Program, CCP, which is also supported by the U.S. Department of State. Set against this background of U.S. expertise, partnership, and information sharing that you in Congress can be rightly proud of authorizing the budgets for, I'd now turn to some of the specifics of the Chongchong-gang and the Cuban role. It's already been covered by members of Congress, so I won't go there again, except to say that the evidence and testimony provided today make clear that contrary to both the North Korean shipping declaration, which I provided you a copy of, and Cuban government statements, which were highlighted earlier by members of Congress, the shipment was without doubt a violation of UN sanctions on North Korea. The statements issued by the Cuban authorities following the seizure are misleading to say the least, because of the other cargo of military equipment that the ship was transporting, which they failed to mention. Within the context of Cuba-related North Korean vessel movements, I think it is important to note that prior to the seizure of the Chongchong-gang, there were a number of other North Korean vessels calling at Cuban ports. Some of these voyages may be assessed as carrying a high risk of proliferation concern on the basis of the vessel's flag, age, past registration, ownership patterns, its safety record, and most importantly, various voyage routing anomalies. A number of these vessels were bulk carriers that may have contained the same hidden compartments or hold space that the SIPRI investigation highlighted were found aboard the Chongchong-gang. A number of these other vessels also switch off their AIS radar transporters, and this is a common risk indicator for various forms of maritime trafficking. A number of these vessels were ultimately owned by shell companies, behind which stand the same company that owned the Chongchong-gang. Given the illicit cargo and the concealed hold space found aboard the Chongchong-gang, it is my opinion that these earlier North Korean voyages to Cuba would be worthy of investigation. But what Congress is asking is what has to happen now. And what has to happen now is really full disclosure and access to Cuba for the United Nations panel of experts attached to the sanctions committee responsible for DPRK sanctions. As a first step, the Cuban authorities will need to invite the United Nations panel of experts charged with investigating violations of UN sanctions on North Korea to Cuba. The Cuban authorities would have to provide the UN panel of experts with full disclosure on all aspects of the agreements, contracts, background, loading, and transfer of the illicit Cuban origin military equipment that was seized aboard the Chongchong-gang. Once the panel of experts were satisfied that the terms of full disclosure for this voyage had been met, they would have a clearer understanding of the Cuban personalities, ministries, and agencies involved in that illicit transfer. Secondly, for the purposes of full disclosure relating to the other North Korean vessel voyages to Cuba, the Cuban authorities would have to grant the United Nations panel of experts access to all Port Authority documentation and all documentation relating to the voyages themselves, any port state control safety inspections that may have been partially carried out but not filed with the respective Port State Control Memoranda of Understanding, the MOU. The Cuban authorities would have to provide access to the relevant customs officials and dock workers for interview purposes as well. If the Cuban authorities are unwilling to make this kind of full disclosure and provide the invitation to visit Cuba and interview officials, then the earlier misleading statements made on 16th July by the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Affairs will appear to be more than a one-off. It will appear as if they have something to hide on a systematic basis. In concluding this testimony, I should say that on the basis of our research, we believe that the Chongchong-gang incident is unusual, not because the vessel was transporting concealed illicit commodities. The Chongchong-gang incident was unusual because it involved an actual seizure and confiscation of illicit commodities. It may seem strange to members of Congress that a North Korean vessel with a very large North Korean flag painted on the ship's funnel could expect to sail in and out of the Caribbean Sea, which is effectively America's backyard, the most intensely surveilled waters in terms of counter-narcotics trafficking anywhere in the world, and take delivery of an illicit arms shipment from Cuba. Such a gamble certainly appears foolhardy with the benefit of hindsight. but it may not have been seen as a great risk if such shipments were undertaken in the past without problems. There were certainly less obtrusive options open to the North Koreans. They could have used a variety of other North Korean-controlled ships that are registered under other flags of convenience, formerly owned by offshore entities registered in East or Southeast Asia. And compared with the Cheongcheong-gang, these high-risk proliferation vessels are much more difficult to identify, and the majority of them do not sail under the flags of states that have signed boarding agreements with the U.S. as part of the Proliferation Security Initiative, PSI. So to summarize, I believe that the Cheongcheong-gang seizure highlights a number of points. The first is the need for full disclosure by the Cuban authorities to the UN panel of experts on North Korea on both this shipment and other North Korean-related voyages of concern to Cuba in recent years. The second point is that the Cheongcheong-gang seizure demonstrates the continuing utility of building the capacities of choke point ports and nations such as Panama, as well as other partner states and open registries that occupy strategic positions along potential proliferation supply chains. In these activities, the United States is well placed to assist partners and allies around the world to counter such acts of proliferation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Werlau.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to offer you this testimony. My written statement is much more extensive, and I respectfully ask that it be considered for the record. As we have been discussing, on July 10th, Panama discovered the North Korean flagship with concealed weapons from Cuba. To those familiar with the history and true nature of the Cuban regime, the only surprise is that it got caught and that it was widely reported by news organizations. In 2003, David Kay, Special Advisor on Iraqi WMD search, said on national TV that remarkable evidence had been found in Iraq of North Korean missiles going to Cuba. Nobody seemed to take notice, at least publicly. North Korea and Cuba, it turns out, have much in common. Both regimes have been ruled for decades by military dictatorships under the helm of respective families controlling a vast repressive apparatus. Both pay homage to orthodox communism, at least in theory and when convenient. Both have terrified their people into submission, flaunted basic rules and standards of civilized nations, and committed crimes against humanity. Both work actively against our interests and threaten our security. Their command economies are both technically bankrupt, spreading misery amongst the people, yet allowing privileges to the ruling elite. Both have perfected the art of milking the international community for concessions, massive aid and subsidies, favorable terms of trade and investment, and loans they never pay. Their allies are fellow rogue regimes, and together they have formed what, in their own words, is a joint front against the common enemy, the United States. My written testimony offers considerable detail of evident ties between the two. Since 2001, official visits, especially of a military nature, mutual praise, and reiterations of the strong fraternal ties have visibly multiplied. Two visits stand out. In November 2004, several North Korean senior generals arrived in Cuba and met with then-President Fidel Castro and Defense Minister Raul Castro. They spent several days evaluating Cuba's military infrastructure and touring manufacturing and assembly facilities of its defense industry conglomerate. Cuba confirmed a strengthening military cooperation and pledged to fight shoulder to shoulder with the Korean army and people. Another unusual visit concluded around 10 days, less actually, than before the ship was seized by Panama. The General Staff of North Korea's army, who had already been to Cuba, led a high-ranking military delegation to, as he proclaimed, meet colleagues in the same trench. They stayed several days, met with top military brass, including President General Raul Castro, toured military installations, and inspected military equipment. According to Cuba's state media, the highly fraternal exchange included detailed information on combat readiness, staff training, and the use of the technology and weaponry. On August 25th, 38 days after the ship was stopped in Panama, the head of Cuba's Air Force, a division general, said to have been in charge of the shipment, was reported by state media killed in a car accident. It was a Sunday morning, and details such as location, circumstances, or witnesses were not provided. He was immediately cremated and buried 2 days later. 5 days later, reports surfaced that the 4-star North Korean general who had just returned from Cuba had been removed, his fate unknown. 2 timely and convenient coincidences. What explains the armed trafficking? In my view, these visits and others in between point to deliberate and concerted efforts. As for North Korea, our government confirmed last May that it defies sanctions through established channels to supply its missile and nuclear programs. Regarding Cuba, it is entirely feasible that the Castro regime would risk getting caught. First, it is in desperate need of hard currency to keep the dictatorship in power and rescuing its faltering economy. The Venezuelan economy is in dire straits, facing a huge liquidity crisis, and its massive subsidies to Cuba are probably declining. Second, the Cuban regime is emboldened by the impunity the international system has afforded even its worst crimes. For Cuba and North Korea, nothing is too outrageous. There's a saying in Spanish, Dios los cría, ellos se juntan. God creates them and they find each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Nicotine.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sierras, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the recent incident of proliferation from Cuba and the UN Sanctions Committee's possible response. Chairman Salmon, with your permission, I'd like to submit my statement for the record and summarize it here in a few brief remarks. Interdiction of banned goods to and from North Korea is a binding obligation on all UN member states, but implementation has been uneven. Overall, the risk of interdiction has likely raised the cost of illicit transfers for the North Korean regime and limited the number of its trading partners, most of them outlier states like Cuba. However, multiple reported cases of arms interdictions over the past 5 years show that North Korea continues to work to evade UN sanctions. Each time there is an interdiction of a banned shipment, the international community learns more about North Korea's evasion techniques. Panama's seizure of the North Korean freighter, the Changchungang, and its cache of hidden weapons will provide insights into North Korean sanctions evasion. If the UN confirms the ship was carrying banned weapons, the seizure would be the first case of a North Korean arms shipment to or from Cuba being reported to the UN Security Council, and the first time such a case would be reported in the Western Hemisphere. There is not yet any official confirmation of the exact content or the reasons behind the shipment. But even if the shipment was sent to North Korea for repair, as the Cuban government claims, it would still be an arms transfer and therefore prohibited. This shipment raises questions about whether there have been other undetected shipments of weapons between Cuba and North Korea, as my fellow witnesses have raised. All UN member states are authorized to interdict suspicious shipments to or from North Korea, but these measures are not always followed. Panama did follow these procedures. They stopped a suspicious ship for inspection, and when it discovered the weapons, they seized them and promptly invited the UN panel of experts to go there to inspect. The panel of experts is a group of technical experts as part of the UN Secretariat that reports to the Security Council Sanctions Committee. The UN investigation of this case is still ongoing, and the results of the inspection in Panama have not been made public. That visit would have focused on identifying the cargo and interviewing the crew. Most likely, the experts will next seek to identify the specific actors that were involved in the transaction, including seeking information from the Cuban government, as Mr. Griffiths pointed out. One possible, the Sanctions Committee, which is actually the same as the members of the Security Council, will then examine the information from the experts and determine whether there was a violation and decide what to do. One possible response would be to add the names of the parties involved to a designation list. This list identifies individuals, companies, or government entities involved in illicit transfers. Member states are then expected to deny transactions with those on the list. In the past, adding names to this list has been highly political and has only been done as part of a new Security Council resolution after major breaches such as a North Korean nuclear missile test. However, the Security Council could decide to amend this list at any time. Separately, individual countries may choose to add these entities or individuals to their own watch lists. Outside the UN context, the U.S. has worked to improve other countries' interdiction capabilities through the Proliferation Security Initiative, or PSI. Panama is a strong PSI partner, and U.S. and partner countries hold annual training exercises under Panamax to prepare for interdiction scenarios in the Panama Canal. The government of Panama's successful seizure of the Changchungang shipment may encourage additional states in Latin America and the Caribbean to take similar action. Congress may wish to consider whether adequate resources are being provided to support PSI and other programs that help countries strengthen their export controls, train custom officials, and improve detection of illicit shipments. This may be particularly important for Latin American and Caribbean countries who may be transshipment points. Congress may also wish to examine whether the Security Council should revise the designations list on a more routine basis, and could also show support for continuing to make publicly available the panel of experts' findings on these illicit transfers. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to the subcommittee's questions.
Thank you. I'd really like to thank our three distinguished witnesses for sharing these very thoughtful and provocative ideas. The big reason that we convened this hearing is because this was a very, very significant incident here in the Western Hemisphere, and because I don't believe that there's been adequate scrutiny with the international media on this subject, this issue. And I've also had conversations with people that are close to the process of what's happening with the Sanctions Committee at the United Nations. And quite frankly, I'm very skeptical that given the fact that the Cuban representatives have been putting on what I'd call a charm offensive and acting, I don't know, it kind of reminds me of Leave It to Beaver, you know, Eddie Haskell. Good morning, Mrs. Cleaver. You know, turning on all the charm and all the, you know, looking like you're actually cooperating when the effort is actually a public relations effort to try to deep six everything. And I'm really skeptical as to whether the Sanctions Committee is going to have the wool pulled over their eyes in this instance, and the Cuban companies involved are going to get just a mere slap on the hands and try to sweep everything under the rug. That's why we called this committee. I think we need to call world attention to a very, very serious issue. And given that the sanctions contained in Iran, I'm going to ask my question to Mr. Griffiths. Given that the sanctions contained in Iran, North Korea, Syria Non-Proliferation Act already ostensibly apply to Cuba, what beyond the current range of sanctions that we have in place against the Cuban regime could we do? And what additional legislative measures do you think we should take? Please elaborate.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not an expert on U.S. legislation, but if your end goal is to find out more and you fear the wool may be pulled over people's eyes, for me, the first one very concrete thing would be to get full congressional support for making sure that the Cuban authorities really extend an invitation to the UN panel of experts to Cuba and provide the full disclosure I mentioned earlier. And if they don't, that will prove that they have quite a lot to hide, especially regarding the command and control of this illicit transfer, who was responsible. Because if they don't provide full disclosure, it will indicate that this perhaps went to the very top. And as I said before, for Congress to really push to make sure that the U.S. government or other UN member states really ensure that the Cubans cooperate over these earlier voyages as well. Right now, the UN panel of experts has not been invited to Cuba and has not been offered full disclosure. And this is the litmus test, if you will. And if they don't go down that road of cooperation and share information, then I would suggest, a further investigation is merited to determine the extent of these shipments and this trade.
Thank you. I also, I believe it was you, Ms. Werlau, that mentioned that the two principal negotiators of this deal, one from Cuba and one from Korea, are both, one's dead and one's missing. And so it's going to be very, very difficult to get at the truth. Given the fact that these two principals are gone, how confident are you that, that the Sanctions Committee is going to be able to get to the bottom of this?
I'm very confident that Cuba is going to manage it, and they can. They own the economy, they own the country, the regime. They're going to clean up their act, and I've worked at the UN. I've had the opportunity to work in Geneva and New York to do advocacy activities. The power of the Cuban delegations there, the size, the influence is impressive. And they have their allies. So I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of this, not through that channel.
You think they're pretty good at public relations campaigns?
Cuba has a vast propaganda apparatus that is supported not just by a huge public relations empire, media, radio stations, publications, news agencies, cultural centers. They have a very effective, well-trained, and large intelligence service. Most of their diplomats are trained intelligence officers. Yeah, it's very effective, and they convince a lot of people who are not well informed, who are well-meaning, who think that they're changing, that don't understand the criminal nature of this regime.
Thank you. I yield back. Yeah, I recognize the ranking member.
I find it very difficult to think that the Cuban government is going to cooperate on any kind of committee going to Cuba and trying to investigate whatever company, because the company is the state, and so is North Korea. So I just find it very difficult to think that the Cuban government is going to open its doors and say, oh, here's what happened, and tell the world what happened. I just don't see that happening. I worry about the UN, because quite frankly, in the past, they have disappointed me many times when it comes to issues of human rights in Cuba. I mean, at one time, they had the Vice President of the Human Rights Commission being from Cuba. I mean, that is the most absurd situation you could have, when human rights in Cuba, they were non-existent. And yet, at the UN, you had somebody from Cuba being part of the Human Rights Commission. That's I guess the the military apparatus of these two countries have to be pretty in dire condition to have this exchange. I just wonder what you think about that. Why at this time have such shipment? I'm curious if anybody can take a shot at that. I know that North Korea has been rattling the saber down on South Korea. So I was just wondering if it's all related. And I am quite frankly concerned with the relationships between Cuba, Iran, and the Western Hemisphere. You know, and the people traveling back and forth from Cuba to Iran. So can you comment on that? We'll start with you.
Thank you very much. I don't have an independent source of information that confirms what the motivations were. But in doing a survey of the experts' views on this shipment, I think we can narrow it down to a few other options besides this idea of Cuba sending the equipment for repairs. That was their story. They apparently said that they thought that would not contradict the UN Security Council resolutions, but the most recent versions of those resolutions have been strengthened to also prohibit that kind of activity. So North Korea is also strapped for hard currency, and it's possible that they, if they were not going to use those systems in their own military, that they would have a capability to refurbish and sell to third parties. We just don't know. So that's another possibility that's being discussed.
No, as I said in my testimony, it doesn't surprise me that they would attempt this. There certainly is a need in Cuba, and they are using the most outrageous schemes to get hard currency, exploiting their own people, sending people off to as migrants to send money back to the regime, exporting doctors as temporary workers in schemes of modern slavery. Anything can be expected of Cuba to make a buck. There's a report in Uruguay, I believe in late July, that Uruguay imported $1 million in blood from Cuba. Now, I looked into this. We're going to publish a report. Turns out Cuba massively collects blood from their citizens, telling citizens that it's to save lives. And they're actually turning people into donors, regular donors, saying that they're going to get sick if they don't donate blood. And this is to sell it. This is a regime that drained the blood of political prisoners on their way to execution in the 1960s and sold it to Vietnam, for example. Including, by the way, an American citizen, Robert Fuller. His blood was drained on the way to execution just for trying to form a resistant movement in Cuba, very much like the Castro brothers had against Batista dictatorship. Anything is possible from this regime to make a buck.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin, I was just wondering if you really think that Cuba is going to cooperate in any way, shape, or form with this.
Well, on a point made by yourself and a colleague, I mean, I don't think anyone would deny the fact that the UN has some limitations, given its membership and its mandate. But I have to say that the UN panel of experts on North Korea and those members of the Secretariat associated with the panel have done a very good job. They're one of the best panels. You read the latest report by that panel, published earlier this summer, 2013, and it's really an outstanding piece of investigative research. They've dug up some very interesting shipments, and they've identified suspected parties in places as far away as Kazakhstan relating to North Korean shipments to Iran. So if that team are invited into Cuba and are given access to the officials and the documents, both on the Chongchongang and these earlier ship voyages, North Korean ship voyages, I'm quite confident that they would get to the bottom of it. The question is, will they be invited? And you members of Congress are skeptical that they will be invited, but that decision, I guess, hasn't been made yet. So in some way, maybe this hearing will contribute to an understanding at the UN and amongst Cubans who are open to listening that full access and full disclosure is absolutely necessary. And if it's not granted, that's going to confirm many people's worst fears. So that's what I can say on that subject. On the other issue, the nature of maritime trafficking is such that if the arms or drugs are not being shipped directly to a country like the United States or France or Spain or Britain, but to two third countries such as Cuba and North Korea, then there are very few open source reports on maritime trafficking, and there are very few seizures. So much goes underneath the radar, so many vessel movements that are suspect that are never investigated, because the international law of the sea gives sovereignty of the vessel to the flag state, which in this case is either North Korea or some open registries, flags of convenience that can't exercise their sovereignty or are unwilling to exercise their sovereignty, who don't have the intelligence or the law enforcement capacities to do so. So the Chong Gang is probably not an isolated case, in my opinion. When you say why now, it's given general patterns, it's quite possible there have been other earlier ones. But as we make clear in our investigation and has been documented by the UN panel of experts and others, the North Koreans are on the lookout for jet fighter spare parts to maintain their fleets. So that they're always on the lookout for those. They're in the market.
Thank you. We are probably going to be called for vote on the floor for two amendments any time now, but we have about 10 minutes at least, so we can go recognize.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. As we know, the Castro regime is and always has been a supporter, a facilitator of terrorism. It has a long history of proliferation activities, has actively sought to undermine the U.S. and our interests by any means possible. For decades, the Castros have harbored fugitives from U.S. justice, including convicted cop killer Joanne Chesimard, as Congressman Sears always reminds us, and he has a vast and sophisticated intelligence network operating against the United States. And the Castro brothers also have a well-documented, deep-rooted connection to rogue regimes like Iran and North Korea, united in a mutual hatred for the United States. As we have been talking about, days after the seizure of this North Korean flagged ship, the Cuban authorities released a statement claiming that they were obsolete defensive weapons sent to North Korea for repair, only to be returned to Cuba. But as you've pointed out, it's obvious they were lying to the international community to hide the fact that the final destination was North Africa in violation of UN sanctions. The Castro regime is desperate to keep its propaganda machine running and its hold on power. And Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime will stop at nothing to continue its illicit activities. So I ask you, what should the U.S. government be doing to support allies in the region, like Panama, for their security and their law enforcement efforts? Also, what penalties do you think the international community should impose on Cuba for these activities, in addition to the bans we have in place? And despite these blatant violations of UN sanctions, this administration continues efforts to normalize relations with Cuba, moving forward with talks regarding migration and direct mail services in the middle of what has been going on. What message do you think it sends to our commitment to regional security to move ahead with talks with the regime, despite this blatant violation of international law like the one involving the North Korean ship? Anyone who'd like to take a stab? Thank you, Ms. Werlau.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. I'm really not prepared to answer such a big question. All I can say is that the people who understand the criminal nature of this regime should inform others, and it's the responsibility of our government. There's more than 50 years, 55 years of history there, including the murder of American citizens, citizens of other countries, subversion, terrorism, I think thousands of deaths worldwide caused by this regime. And it's important that we don't get confused by the message. The Cubans are extremely able.
And I will interrupt you there because you bring out an important fact, and then I'll yield back. We let the Castro regime get away with the murder of 4 innocent pilots, of Brothers to the Rescue, in the shoot down of their 2 aircraft over international airspace. 3 American citizens, 1 U.S. resident. And what price did the Castro brothers pay for their crime? They signed a bill into law, the administration at the time, that they have yet to put into action. That was it. That was the penalty that they paid. So we let that problem go unanswered. And now we have another horrible example of a violation of international law, and we're about to let them off the hook yet again. No wonder they continue to do their espionage and dangerous activities against the U.S. We are willing to look the other way because it's just, to act would be inconvenient.
Yes, may I add, Mr. Chairman, to that? It's very frustrating when you're doing human rights documentation and getting the reports from Cuba, where they're using surgical repression to exterminate the opposition, assaulting women, children. I mean, this is a regime that has massacred children.
The tugboat, 13th of March, where they put high-pressure water cannons against people, killing dozens of them for the crime of trying to leave the hellhole that is the Castro regime's Cuba.
And that is just one. And what we're getting in our news reports are reports about old cars, mojitos.
Oh, yes.
And Raul Castro's reforms.
It's an interesting place.
Yes, I mean, it's very frustrating.
And if you're a media outlet and you report on the human rights violations instead of reporting on the cute 1950s cars, then you get your license taken away. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have about 7 minutes left on the clock to get back for our vote on the floor. But Mr. Rohrabacher is the only one that's expressed that he does have a question, and so I'm going to go ahead and yield to Mr. Rohrabacher.
1 minute. Thank you very much. Let me just note that Castro's regime has been a disgraceful example of corruption and repression since day one. One of the first things he did was, of course, send off aid to insurgents in Venezuela to overthrow their elected government. He then made his country into a haven for Robert Vesco and other major drug dealers. He murdered his own people by the hundreds, and I will tell you, it is a disgrace that the liberals in this country gave him such leeway over the years, never to calling Castro to task for all of this a violation of human rights on a mass scale in his own country. Let me just say that it's a miracle, it would seem a miracle to me, that he has lived as long as he has, with his number of people who have been praying that he was going to die soon over all these years. But I'm sure that he will be leaving this planet soon, and there will be a warm place waiting for him right next to Che Guevara, and none too soon. Again, the American people need to see that all along he's been conducting himself and involved with illicit activities, drug dealing, arms dealing throughout the world, and it shouldn't surprise us now. One last thought, Mr. Chairman, that is, we should be insisting that all of the money that he has stored up in foreign banks be found out and be given to the people of Cuba once this dictator is dead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair apologizes. I recognize the gentleman from American Samoa.
That's all right, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And as a follow-up on my good friend from California's line of question, and I just want to pose this to Dr. Griffith and our 2 witnesses here. I said I'm very concerned at the fact that the non-inspection, at least the way the Chong gang has been inspected, as I believe, Dr. Griffith, you mentioned that there have been 3 other occasions or 3 other Korean vessels that have gone between Cuba and North Korea. Here's the, it may sound hypothetical, but The fact that the non-inspection of these vessels could well have contained nuclear weapons, missiles that are capable of coming right in the backyard of the United States, putting an obvious risk on the security of this country, is what concerns me. So we can talk about drugs, we can talk about, but the effect that if it was possible for North Korea to do this, and 3 other occasions that we have no idea what was being transferred of those 3 earlier vessels, I'm just curious, is the threat serious, or is it just another one of those bypass that we're not really concerned or should be concerned about? Dr. Griffith.
There have been at least 12 and possibly 13 instances of North Korean ships calling at Cuban ports since 2006 that we're aware of. So the figure is actually considerably higher than reported in the media. It's quite possible there could have been more, because these ships are turning off their radar, the AIS, the signal, their transponder that allows us to, commercial databases to locate ships. And signals can also be faked. But it's between 12 and 13. We're uncertain about the 13th, 100%. We don't know the content of what those ships were carrying, but some of them really do have what we call voyage anomalies, where the ship has sailed in a manner which makes no economic or commercial sense, and it's a typical risk indicator when it comes to arms trafficking or indeed narcotics trafficking.
Thank you, Dr. Griffiths. I've got one more quick question to Ms. Wellau. You mentioned that you published a paper in 2005 giving some estimates of the corporate wealth of the Castro family. Can you just give us one-liner? How much is the Castro family worth right now in Cuba?
I think nobody knows that, not even the people who manage it. It is so well done. The way that it's concealed through safe havens, using other people as they present as the owners of the bank accounts and corporations, it's impossible to tell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All testimony concluded and questions concluded. I'd like to adjourn this meeting, but before I do, just want to say that maybe it would be a good idea for the members of this committee to pen a letter to Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary Ban Ki-moon, to voice our concerns over this process within the UN. And would that be something we could entertain? All right. Well, thank you very much. This committee hearing is now adjourned. Good job, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good. We'll start drafting right away. Thanks.